Welcome to this series meant for the men of Monsignor Farrell High School to review and prepare for the United States History and Government exam from the Regents of the University of the State of New York. This is the new framework exam being given for the very first time in June of 2022. It is a new style exam, unlike previous U.S. History Regents exams. So while previous U.S. History Regents exams, available online, old questions are kicking around out there, other review videos, while that might be useful for reviewing some of the information, it is not what your exam is going to look like. So the first thing, before we begin actual review, is to take a look at what this new Regents exam actually looks like. So, it will be rather different from what you've seen before if you look at old Regents exams. It consists of three parts. First, a stimulus-based multiple-choice question section. What does that mean? These are multiple-choice questions based upon a document, an item, an illustration, a quote that you are given. Do not mistake this for some sort of reading comprehension test. You cannot simply read the quote that they give you and answer the questions afterwards based on nothing but that quote. The questions after are going to see whether you understand and know the information, the context of the history surrounding that particular item. So you will have to bring all of your history knowledge to answer those multiple choice questions about those stimuli. The stimulus is the quote or the photograph or the graph or whatever it is. 28 of the questions on this exam, this is a 3-hour test, will be based on those. So you will have to read a short passage, and then there will be 3 questions about history that will relate somehow to that passage. Part 2 will be stimulus-based short essay questions. You will be given 2 sets of documents. So you'll get a pair of photographs or a graph and a quote or something like this. For each set, you will have to write a short essay, about a paragraph or 2. In the first set, you're going to describe the historical context around the documents and identify the relationship between the events and the ideas found in the document. In other words, you're going to have to recognize what these documents are about and then relate the documents to that event in a cause and effect way, or a similarity and difference way, or as a turning point in that event. The second set will also give you 2 items, 2 documents, and there you're going to have to describe the historical context surrounding the documents and analyze the audience, purpose, bias, or point of view that affects the document's use as a reliable source. Audience, who is it written for? Who is expected to be looking or reading this? Why was this document produced, and how does that affect its reliability? And what is the bias that the creator of it brings, or the point of view that they have? So if you have, let's say, a political poster, that political poster is obviously for a public audience, and it may be meant to rally supporters of that candidate. That's the purpose, and the point of view of the person is that this guy is the greatest guy in the world. All of that affects the reliability of the information, let's say, in that poster. So you're going to have 2 documents here and 2 other documents here, 2 separate little essays. Then you're going to have the civic literacy document-based essay, like a DBQ from of old. So you're going to be given 6 documents with a short question about each. You will have to read and analyze that document, and the answer to the question about that particular document will be probably a few sentences. And then you're going to take the 6 documents and you're going to write a full essay about it. That essay will be to read, analyze, and use the documents as evidence to make a case about some history issue that has affected American life and government. So you'll have to describe the circumstances around that issue, explain efforts by groups or individuals to address the issue, and discuss to the extent to which their efforts were successful or the impact of the efforts on American society. And basically that's sort of the same thing. What did they accomplish? How much did they do? So that's the basic idea. Understand, therefore, that for this sort of an exam, you're going to have to read carefully, think about what it is you have read, and you're going to have to bring your outside information, if you like, to understand the context of these. Before we do actual review for this, therefore, let's take a look at some of the questions, the types of questions that would be asked. So here's a typical set of multiple choice questions of the type that you're likely to see on this exam. I'm just picking a few of these of a particular item that you should know now. So we see, base your answers to questions 4 through 6 on the passage below and on your knowledge of social studies. Well, let's read the passage. We admit, as all must admit, that the powers of the government are limited, and that its limits are not to be transcended. But we think the sound construction of the Constitution must allow to the national legislature that discretion with respect to the means by which the powers it confers are to be carried into execution, which will enable that body to perform the high duties assigned to it in the manner most beneficial to the people. Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Now I'm going to run through these, and you try to pick the answers out. Write down the answer, and I'll go back over what is the correct answer, and then we'll go back over this document and see why and how to approach it. So here's the question. Which constitutional provision was used by Chief Justice John Marshall that is, right, to reach this conclusion? Which constitutional provision was used by Chief Justice Marshall to reach this conclusion? And the correct answer there is the Elastic Clause. We'll go back over these in just a moment. Critics fear that this decision would result in which of these things? And it has it underlined there for you, a stronger federal government that would limit state powers. The precedent set in this case was later used by Congress to establish New Deal programs during the Great Depression. Let's take a look at this again. First, you have to read this and think about it. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote it. in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. McCulloch v. Maryland, you should remember. It is the case about the national bank. This is the bank that Hamilton first proposed at the beginning of the United States, and that the Democrat Republicans opposed. So did Andrew Jackson, opposed it. The Federalists, on the other hand, were fans of the national bank. The argument, if you should remember from McCulloch v. Maryland, was that the Constitution doesn't say anything about Congress having the power to create a national bank. But Hamilton and the Federalists argued that the elastic clause, and we should remember the elastic clause is also called the necessary and proper clause. If we remember that from the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Article 1 gives Congress its powers. There's a clause that says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. In other words, Congress has the power to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying out the previous, the foregoing, the already mentioned powers, and for carrying out all other powers given by the Constitution to the government of the United States. Okay, well, if that's the case, right, the Congress has all necessary and proper. Now, that's called the elastic clause. We should remember why, because it's stretchy. You can stretch the elastic clause to mean, to cover, if you will, a lot of different powers Congress may need. The Federalists said Congress has the power to regulate, that is, control the value of money. Hamilton had said that gives us the power to create a national bank as a way to do that. The people who oppose the bank said it doesn't say bank in the Constitution, so it doesn't give them that power. In McCulloch v. Maryland, Marshall said, we read now, we must admit, as all must admit, that the powers of the government are limited, and that its limits are not to be transcended. To transcend something is to go beyond. So government has limited powers, and you cannot go beyond those powers. But we think the sound construction of the Constitution, construction here means understanding. To construe something in Spanish or Italian is to translate it into English. So the sound understanding of the Constitution must allow the national legislature, that is the Congress, the legislative branch, that discretion, that is, that leeway of decision-making, with respect to the means by which the powers it confers are to be carried into execution, which will enable that body to perform the high duties assigned to it in the manner most beneficial, that is, doing good to the people. We put this together. We think the sound understanding of the Constitution must allow the Congress that leeway with respect to the means by which the powers are to be carried out, which will enable that body to perform the duties assigned to it in a manner that's best for the people. Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution. And all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. So if we think about what he's saying, anything that works to get Congress to do its job is constitutional. So he's using the elastic clause to stretch out the powers of Congress and therefore allow a national bank in this case. The Electoral College Clause doesn't make sense. The Electoral College Clause tells us how we elect a president, and he's not talking about that at all here. The Due Process Clause. Due process says you cannot take somebody's rights away without due process. That is, going to court, for instance. The Equal Protection Clause says every citizen is entitled to equal protection of the law. Well, you should know that the Equal Protection Clause is the 14th Amendment that comes after the Civil War. So the only thing that makes sense here is the Elastic Clause. Okay. I point out to you, you should already be familiar with Marbury v. Madison. That's judicial review. McCulloch v. Maryland, that is, expands the power of the government through the Elastic Clause. And Gibbons v. Ogden, you should remember that one. That's the interstate commerce case. Only Congress has the power to control interstate commerce. That's the case about the ferry across the Hudson from New York to New Jersey. New York couldn't interfere with it because only Congress has power over interstate commerce. All three of these expanded the power of the federal government. Okay. Now let's take a look at the next question here. Based on what we just said, critics feared that this decision, meaning McCulloch v. Maryland, would result in a stronger federal government that would limit state powers. Now, we know that under McCulloch v. Maryland, Maryland, the state, had objected to the national bank. McCulloch v. Maryland said Congress has the power to create that bank whether a state likes it or not. Therefore, there were people who were afraid that it was going to give the federal government too much power over the states. Your other choices here. States being able to nullify federal laws. The nullification process, if you remember, was all about South Carolina, remember that? Wanted to nullify the tariff that the federal government was charging on imports. In other words, the idea was a state could simply ignore a federal law, declare it null, of no value within the state. Well, that's unconstitutional and wrong, and actually this goes against that. This gives the federal government more power, so that's not the correct answer here. This decision is not going to result in states being able to nullify law. Elimination of the amendment process. To amend the Constitution, that is to change it, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to approve an amendment and 3/4 of the state legislatures. This has nothing to do with that. Congressional actions would limit the federal courts. Once again, there's nothing in this about Congress limiting the power of federal courts. This is all about the courts giving the federal government more power to do things like create the national bank. Finally, we have this third question here. The precedent set in this case was later used by Congress to do something. To do what? Not to declare war against Spain. Congress has the power to declare war. This court decision doesn't help that. Reject the Treaty of Versailles after World War II. Well, first of all, the Treaty of Versailles was not after World War II, it was after World War I. And second, the Senate has to approve all treaties. That was already written in the Constitution. That has nothing to do with this decision either. Confirm the appointment of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. Earl Warren was appointed to the Supreme Court in the 1960s. You probably don't remember his name, but it doesn't matter. The Senate gets to approve appointees to the Supreme Court. This court decision has nothing to do with that. Establish New Deal programs during the Great Depression. You should remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, greatly expanded the power of the national government. He created all kinds of new programs that had never been heard of before, where the federal government spent money to try to stimulate the national economy. The federal government hired guys so they would have jobs during the Great Depression. The federal government established Social Security, a national pension system. Well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about the federal government doing any of that. But he relied on that elastic clause. Congress has all power necessary and proper to carry out its duties. And so, during time of the Depression, FDR got Congress to expand tremendously its activism within the economy. To support, if you like, the economic problems that the country was facing. So FDR, by increasing the role of the federal government and getting Congress to give him the authority as president to deal with what was a national emergency, is expanding its role. Okay, so this gives you a basic idea of what these multiple choice questions will look like. And we'll go through a bunch of them during the course of this review. I'll also point out to you now, let's take a look at a couple of these stimulus document questions. Okay, so here we have, let me find the other one here. There we go, the Fugitive Slave Act. The following is an excerpt from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. You should remember the Fugitive Slave Act. It required that anybody in the North who got a slave who was a fugitive, that is, running away from slavery in the South, was required to help return them to slavery in the South. And people were so furious over this, it helped lead to the Civil War. Northerners did not want to be involved with this. Fugitive Slave Act said, among other things, the following: be it further enacted, that any person who knowingly and willingly obstruct, hinder, or prevent such claimant or his agent or attorney, or any person or persons lawfully assisting him, her, or them, from arresting such a fugitive from service or labor, either with or without process as aforesaid, or shall rescue or attempt to rescue such fugitive from service or labor, from the custody of such claimant, his or her agent or attorney, or other person or persons lawfully assisting as aforesaid, when so arrested, pursuant to the authority herein given and declared, or shall aid, abet, or assist such person owing service or labor as aforesaid, directly or indirectly, to escape from such claimant, his agent or attorney, or other person or persons legally authorized as aforesaid, or shall harbor or conceal such fugitive so as to prevent the discovery and arrest of such person, after notice or knowledge of the fact that such person was a fugitive from service or labor as aforesaid, shall, for either of said offenses, be subject to a fine not exceeding $1,000 and imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. And be it further enacted, in all cases where the proceedings are before a commissioner, he shall be entitled to a fee of $10 in full for his services in each case. upon the delivery of the said certificate to the claimant, his agent, or attorney, or a fee of $5 in cases where the proof shall not, in the opinion of such commissioner, warrant such certificate and delivery. Okay. Wow, there's a lot of words, huh? Let's take it easy. Be it further enacted. Okay, this is a law. Any person who shall knowingly and willingly obstruct, hinder, or prevent such claimant from arresting such a fugitive from service or labor shall be subject to a fine not exceeding $1,000 and imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. In other words, if you don't help us catch that slave, you can be arrested, you can be fined, you can be put in jail. That, we should remember, is the heart of the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, they give you this document. They also give you this document. Let me just pull this down a bit. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers, and have top eye opened. Now, Boston, we know, is in Massachusetts. Boston had a lot of abolitionists in it. We should remember up north you had a lot of people against slavery. And this is warning black people that policemen are not your friends. They are going to kidnap you and give you to the slave catchers. This is the warning here. So what do we have? We have two documents. This document is the law from 1850 that says if you do not help capture slaves, you can go to jail. And this is a poster, apparently, right? Seems to be a poster. Warning any black people out there, look out for the cops because they are going to take you and they will turn you over to the slave catchers. Okay, so we have these two documents. Now, they ask you here's the question. Describe the historical context surrounding documents 1 and 2. Analyze document 2 and explain how audience, or purpose, or bias, or point of view affects this document's use as a reliable source of evidence. So the historical context that you should know is you had slavery in the South still. It's before the Civil War. Many slaves were escaping north on the Underground Railroad to get out of the country. They were really going to Canada. Some of them were going through Boston and Massachusetts, and there were a lot of abolitionists up there. In the face of people who were either against slavery or simply didn't want to be involved with slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act forced them to take a side. You couldn't just sit on the sidelines. If you did, you were now subject to arrest. So this is the context for these two. Now you want to analyze this. What's the point of view here? Clearly, this is the point of view of somebody who is against slavery. That's not enough to say, though. The question they ask you, notice this, is analyze audience, or purpose, or point of view, or bias, and how it affects the document's use as a reliable source of evidence. You have to talk about how reliable this is. it says police officers are, by order of the mayor, empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. Is this document reliable? Well, the audience is clearly for, you would think, colored people. This doesn't seem to be saying the law is a good idea. It seems to be the point of view of an abolitionist. Could be a white person who's trying to help the escaped slaves, could be another black person who is warning, other escaped slaves, don't trust the police. Can we rely on the information here? Well, the information seems to be that the mayor and the aldermen have empowered the police to be kidnappers. We might be able to rely on the information that the mayor and the aldermen have passed a law requiring police officers to turn over slaves. Why would you say that publicly this way if that weren't true? So given the fact that it's for a public audience, you could say this must be the case. Otherwise, there's no advantage to an abolitionist to say don't trust the police if the police are really on your side. On the other hand, to call them kidnappers, that's certainly from a point of view. To a policeman, he is maybe thinking about, I don't make the law, I'm just there to enforce it, and I don't want to go to jail myself. So he may have a different view of that word. So you would have to explain that. It's not just enough to say, this is the point of view of somebody against slavery. You have to tell me what has that got to do with how reliable this document is as a source. Okay, and then we'll look just briefly at the last type of question that you will see on this. The civic literacy document-based essay. Read and analyze the documents. Using information from the documents in your knowledge of U.S. history, write an essay. An essay has a beginning, middle, and end. It has a thesis, and you use the evidence that you are given to make your argument. So you have to describe the historical circumstances surrounding this issue. Explain the efforts by individual groups and governments to address the issue, and discuss the extent to which these were successful. Therefore, you have to do three things. You have to describe what this issue is about and the circumstances around it. You have to talk about people or groups who tried to address that issue. And then you have to tell me whether or not they were successful in addressing it. Understand that. If you don't hit all three of those, you are in trouble on this essay. They give you then a series of documents. And I'll just look at these quickly. We'll go back over the details of material here just to see you how this essay works. So here you have Eric Foner, Forever Free, The Story of Emancipation and Reconstruction, 2005. You should be smart enough to figure out if it's in 2005, this is not a Civil War document or something. This is a historian. You might not recognize Eric Foner, but he's a historian. And he's writing about the issue, so it's not a primary source. Before the Civil War, blacks could vote in only a handful of northern states, and black office holding was virtually unheard of. The first African American to hold elective office appears to have been John Langston, chosen as a town clerk in Ohio. But during Reconstruction, perhaps 2,000 African Americans held public office, from Justice of the Peace to Governor and United States Senator. Thousands more headed Union Leagues, it's an organization, and local branches of the Republican Party. edited newspapers, and in other ways influenced the political process. African Americans did not control Reconstruction politics, as their opponents frequently charged, but the advent meaning coming, of black suffrage and office holding after the war represented a fundamental shift in power in Southern life. It marked the culmination of both the constitutional revolution embodied in the 14th and 15th Amendments and the broad grassroots mobilization of the black community. How would you summarize this? Before the Civil War, even in the North, blacks barely had any political voice. But after the Civil War, blacks began to have a voice. They were elected to office, they ran newspapers, they were part of the Republican Party at the time, and they were starting, as a result of the 14th and 15th Amendment, to have a political voice. Okay, interesting document. Document 2. Although 1890 to 2000 is a relatively short span of time, these 11 decades comprise a critical period in American history. This should be 1900 there. This is a typo. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, this is correct. 1890 to 2000. I'm sorry. These 11 decades comprise a critical period in American history. Collapse of Reconstruction after the Civil War led to the establishment of white supremacy in the southern states, a system of domination and exploitation that most whites, in the North as well as the South, expected to last indefinitely. In 1900, despite the nation's formal commitment to racial equality as expressed in the 14th and 15th Amendments, racial discrimination remained a basic organizing principle of American society. In the South, racial discrimination, reinforced by racial segregation, became official state policy. In the North, discrimination and segregation also became widely sanctioned customs that amounted to, in effect, semi-official policy. The federal government practiced racial segregation in the armed services, discriminated against blacks in the civil service, and generally condoned by its actions, if not its words, white supremacy. What is this saying? Despite the fact that blacks after the Civil War started to get a little bit of political power, maybe because of that, whites backlashed, and so you had segregation, where the races were kept separate, and discrimination, where blacks were treated not as slaves anymore perhaps, but as inferior, and kept out of certain jobs, kept in a separate units in the military, and so on. Based on these documents, state one way the end of Reconstruction affected African Americans. And you could say the end of Reconstruction established white supremacy. Reconstruction gave blacks their rights. We saw up here, it was the beginning, the 14th and 15th Amendment, they started to get themselves elected to office. But as Reconstruction ended, and we went into the era, you should remember, of Jim Crow, whites reasserted their power, and that was that. And that would be the answer here. Okay. Here we have document 2. And I just want to give you a taste of this now. We'll go back over this material later. Another document. According to this document, what's one way they disagreed about how African Americans should achieve equality? You have to read carefully. Document 3. There we go. Document 4. Here we have a photograph. That's a sit-in at the lunch counter. This is blacks sitting in there saying we refuse to accept a whites-only lunch counter, and so we're going to stay here, and they had to be arrested to be taken out of there as a protest. One result of the sit-in at Greensboro. Document 5, I'm just going to roll through this for a minute and then show you that, let me pull this up a minute. At the end of this, you have a bunch of documents there. Now you will have to answer this. Throughout United States history, many constitutional civic issues have been debated by Americans. These debates have resulted in efforts by individuals, groups, and governments to address these issues. These efforts have achieved varying degrees of success. One of these constitutional civic issues is African American civil rights. Okay. So you want to describe the historical circumstances around African American fight for civil rights. You want to explain efforts by groups to address it, and you want to describe the extent to which these are successful. And in making each of these cases, you want to make specific reference to the documents that you're given. You want to quote the documents or make specific reference, as it says in document 2, blah, blah, blah. You want to give context to this, and you want to make sure you've answered all parts of that question. If it asks you these 3 things, you better go back and be able to say you've done these 3 things. Okay, so I don't want to take forever on this initial review here. I'm going to try to keep these to about the length of a class period. But this is what you need to think about, therefore. This new framework for United States history and government is going to be that format. Let me just show you again. "28 questions, multiple choice, like I showed you. A quote, and then 3 questions, and you better, the answer is not in the document on these multiple choice questions. You have to know what the document is making reference to. 2 sets of those little essays, 2 sets of those little documents. Document 1, document 2, and you're going to have to say, how are they related? Cause and effect, turning point, audience, purpose, and you're going to have to recognize what the context is. And then finally, 6 little sets of documents with a question on each document, and you're going to have to pull them all together in a big essay on a civic issue. Okay, hopefully these reviews going forward will be helpful to you as you get ready to do that, but nothing substitutes for your own study and review of material. If you want to look online for old Regents exams, that's okay if it helps you sort of quiz yourself on major facts in American history, but the questions are not going to be like those that you see on the Regents that you take at the beginning of June.